सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Our stellar defense and foreign affairs team at ThePrint, which combines youth, as you can see in this picture, and experience, right? They've been bringing you this brilliant series of articles, opinion, videos on 60 years of 1962 war, because nations remember their victories, that's quite easy, but the nations that remember their defeats and learn from them, they are the ones who go on to grow greater and win more victories going ahead. So while that is going on, something else happened at exactly the same time in 1962. That is something that we haven't been talking about very much. All right, you can say Begani ki shadi mein Abdullah Divana. This is something happened between Soviet Union and the US in a place called Cuba and around it. You know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So why should we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis? Now the fact is that on this day, that is 27th of October, depending on how do you calculate time zones, 27, 28 in India, America, etc., on this date, exactly 60 years ago, was when the world came closest to a nuclear Armageddon. Now, we'll tell you that story. We have to revisit that story, the story that is also called the B-59 submarine incident. But before we go there, I might also want to put this in perspective for today, because this is not a history class. I'm not taking you back to something that happened 60 years ago and we're doing a nice video with a little bit of background music, so you think, oh, drama, lots of TV channels do these things these days. I'm not doing that. I am telling you the perspective today. So a few things have happened lately. So just a month back, that is 29th of September, this story came out. The British government revealed this almost 3 weeks later. But on 29th of September, a Royal Air Force surveillance and electronic warfare aircraft, which was running ferries, obviously surveillance and reconnaissance ferries, over Black Sea. Now, NATO forces, America, they've been flying a lot of their reconnaissance assets in that area. Why? Because they then pick up missile launches, other stuff, pick up intelligence and share it with the Ukrainians, because there's a war going on. So this Royal Air Force aircraft called Rivet Joint. Now, Rivet Joint is a surveillance version of a C-135. C-135s are these old giant 4-jet engine aircraft, a bit like, I think, more or less the same ancestry as the old 707s of the past. Now, these have been converted into very potent surveillance and electronic warfare aircraft. So, one of those aircraft is now called RC-135. R stands for reconnaissance, and generally it goes with the popular name Rivet Joint. So, Rivet Joint was being pursued by 2 Russian Air Force Sukhoi 27 fighters, and it so happened, now a lot of this pursuit goes on, it's gone on through Cold War. A lot of it goes on between the Chinese and the American assets, both naval and air, in the part of the Indo-Pacific, which is more to the east, right? Now, something like that happening, one pursuing the other, is not a big deal. But in this case, one of the 2 Sukhois pursuing this Rivet Joint aircraft released a missile, an air-to-air missile. Now, we don't know if the missile was aimed at this aircraft, because if it was aimed at this aircraft, it will be difficult for a missile, if it was launched within range, to miss, because Russian missiles may not have a great range, may not have great accuracy from a distance, but if they are launched within range, they are deadly, because they pack a big sizable warhead and then they don't miss if they are within range. This Rivet Joint is a huge aircraft, unlikely that it will have the maneuverability to evade that missile. Now, Russian Air Force later claimed that this was a tech error. I mean, you will have to be very gullible to believe it, but at this point, it's convenient for everybody to believe it and let it go. But the fact is, you came very close to an international crisis involving superpowers. NATO on the one hand, Russia on the other, in a nuclearized environment. Now, immediately after this incident, how serious this incident was is indicated by the fact that the British Secretary of Defense, Ben Wallace, then went to the US to exchange notes with his American counterparts. And obviously, those notes must have been about what might have happened if this missile had actually hit their aircraft, because that would have ratcheted up a serious crisis. Since then, it's also been decided that British aircraft, RAF aircraft flying those missions will also be escorted by their fighters. So that is one thing that's happened. The other things that's happened is the Russian noise about nuclear weapons. Now, Russians have been pulling out nuclear weapons, carrying out exercise. They carried out a live exercise just last week where they fired a bunch of missiles, obviously without warheads, to check that they were landing on their targets, etc., etc. And Putin himself supervised it, although Putin has now come and made a public statement that he's not going to use the nukes in Ukraine. But you know what? Russians and Putin also said, they always said they were never going to invade Ukraine. So the fact is that nuclear threat level has also gone up. And third is something that happened closer home. That was on March 9 this year, earlier this year on March 9, Indian Air Force, when they were apparently carrying out some routine maintenance work over their own Brahmos missiles, they let loose one, and that missile landed in Pakistan. That missile landed deep inside Pakistan. Now just think about what that missile, that incident could have led to. That incident, if the Pakistanis had detected it in time, then if you are in a nuclearized, hostile environment, in an environment of near hostile relationship and very little diplomatic contact, we don't even have ambassadors in each other's countries. Somebody sitting at the other end could have thought easily that India has launched a nuclear missile. Now, the fact is, so far at least, a Brahmos missile is not nuclear capable. That's why for range as well as for the warhead it carries, it falls in the conventional category, and this does not come under the restrictions of MTCR or Missile Technology Control Regime. But looking at it from the point of view of a Pakistani who's watching his airspace, immediate reaction might have been India has launched a nuclear missile. How can I take chances? So let me also respond. Now the fact is that for whatever reason, I'm sure there was an immediate communication between our DGMO and the Pakistani DGMO. Those are Directors General of Military Operations. They have a hotline. It seems as if the hotline worked and somebody was on the phone immediately with the Pakistani saying, listen, we messed up. We know that we launched a missile we should not have, but this has just been loosed off, but this does not have a warhead. Don't worry about it. I'm very sorry. Won't happen again, or something like that. So this was averted. So you've now had three situations, two situations of an active crisis, of a missile being launched, one landing but without a warhead, the other one not hitting its target, going somewhere else, obviously going into the sea finally. And in third case, the world's preeminent nuclear weapons power, the nuclear weapons power with the largest number of nuclear warheads, carrying out live exercises and constantly raising the alarm levels. So Russian Defense Minister Shoigu has been calling his counterparts all over the world. He called Rajnath Singh, our own defense minister, also just the other day, expressing apprehension that Ukrainians may be contemplating the use of a dirty weapon. Dirty weapon is like a crude nuclear weapon in one of their own cities. In this case, he says Melitopol, which might then become an excuse to blame the Russians, etc., etc., which a lot of the skeptics in the world, a lot of the Putin skeptics, they think that Putin is building up some kind of an excuse to use a tactical nuclear weapon himself because he is losing the war on the ground. So you've seen these near nuclear situations within this year, within the last few months. I'm not even complaining about or adding to this list the missiles that North Korea keeps on launching in the seas all the time. I think whenever the uncle there feels a little bit unwanted and wants a few headlines and attention, he fires a few missiles. I think he's got a lot in his stockpile. Increasingly now that's become so unsensational that he doesn't even get much headlines outside of that region. But that apart, these incidents tell you that when you have nuclear weapons, one, threats become real. Threats also of accidental warfare become real. And in this case, accidental warfare is not an incident on the line of control or on a border where a few people get killed on one side, then there's retaliation. Not like that. In this case, once a nuclear weapon is launched wrongly, you don't know what can happen, because that's not an escalation ladder that you can then control or that you can pull away. Because once you are on the ladder, you are going up because there's no time to think. And that's the reason we take you back to what happened in Sargasso Sea, or maybe for some time under Sargasso Sea, under the water, when this Russian or Soviet then submarine B-59 got caught and was surrounded by American anti-submarine aircraft and American anti-submarine ships. Now we take you back to 1962. So just at a time when war had broken out between India and China, 20th of October 1962, within the same week, a world war-like situation erupted close to America, because then news came out that the Soviet Union had decided to base its nuclear weapons in Cuba, which is very close to America, which means all these nuclear weapons will then have America in their direct range. And America, with Kennedy as the president, was not willing to accept it no matter what happened. So there was a lot of pressure in America and Washington to go and nuke the Cubans, or maybe nuke Moscow, nuke whatever, because soldiers very often tend to be more hawkish, because they know usually one solution to every problem, that is to blow the other guy up before he comes and blows you up. But Kennedy kept his nerve. There were some backroom talks going on. Kennedy had assigned his brother to talk with the Soviet ambassador then in Washington, Dobrynin. Some of these talks were going on famously in a Chinese restaurant in Washington. So he was giving negotiations a chance. It was in that situation, because operations were going on at the same time, that 4 Soviet submarines with nuclear weapons on them. Remember, these were not nuclear-powered submarines. We are still in 1962. These were normal diesel-electric submarines of Foxtrot class. In fact, Foxtrot class should be familiar to us in India as well, because the first submarines that the Indian Navy got, 1967 onwards, were also from the Foxtrot class. They had come from Soviet Union of the same Foxtrot class, obviously without any nuclear weapons. So these Foxtrot submarines were trying to break the American blockade, because America had laid a blockade around Cuba. They were trying to break that blockade, run that blockade and reach Cuba. And they had nuclear weapons on them. And American ships, submarines, aircraft were hunting for them. These were not very advanced submarines. It was not so easy for them to hide. And remember, they had been driving all the way from the north of the Soviet Union. So they were tired, crews were tired, the machines were tired, and the submarines had to keep coming up to recharge their batteries. This particular submarine we are talking about, B-59, this by this time had very little charge left in its batteries. It had very little oxygen. Its carbon dioxide levels in the submarine were very high, to be almost toxic to the crew. The temperature inside had gone up to 65 degrees Celsius. It was inhuman to survive there. So the submarine surfaced to recharge its batteries. And that's when it seems the US aircraft and naval vessels caught it. They trapped it, they surrounded it, and they were firing at it. They were not firing at it to hurt it or to sink it, but they were firing at it in a threatening manner. But you know what happens? When hostile aircraft are flying 20 meters above your conning tower, right? And blinding you with very heavy searchlights and firing all around you. In fact, more than 300 shells were fired around this submarine. It panics you, particularly if you've been underwater all these days, great risk, very little communication. In fact, no communication back home because there was complete radio silence, and those days there was no satellite communication. So this ship's captain and crew had no idea what was going on. So that is when this submarine in panic. The captain of the submarine, Valentin Savitsky, in some panic, decided to launch a nuclear missile, a nuclear torpedo as it was called then, on the Americans, and that would have set off a nuclear war. Now, how do we know more about this? A lot of archival study has been done on the Cuban Missile crisis. And there are institutions which are collecting first-person testimonies, oral history, documentation, and building archives. So The Guardian yesterday carried a detailed story, and you will see a screenshot of that story on my screen, and I'm sharing a link with you for the entire story. Guardian carried a story of some new data that has come out, a newly translated account which has come out at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. So this archival account also has the account of another Soviet officer who was like the number 2 on this submarine, called Vasily Arkhipov. Now, Vasily Arkhipov is an important figure here because while he's number 2 on the submarine, he is also chief of staff of the 69th Submarine Brigade, as the Russians called it, or the submarine detachment which had been sent to that area. So the Soviet principle was that before launching a nuclear weapon on a submarine, the captain had to get the concurrence of one more officer, which in this case was the political officer. Every such Russian vessel had a political officer from the Communist Party, understandably. So in this case, the political officer was Semyonovich Maslenikov. So Semyonovich Maslenikov and the captain of the submarine himself, they were now in agreement with each other that they should launch a nuclear weapon on the Americans because a war had broken out. They had to make that presumption in that hostile environment with depth charges and cannon shells going all around them. Now, it was evident, as the later account showed, that many people could see that these depth charges, while they were bursting very close to the submarine, were not doing any damage. So these were empty depth charges, but not everything was empty. Because while the American vessel's instructions were to not harm the submarine as yet, it comes out from the same archival evidence that some of the American officers themselves were trigger happy and they were getting impatient and they were very frustrated that they were just firing this faltu stuff at this submarine when they had a Soviet target in front of them, a juicy target, and there was a war-like situation. Again, communication was limited. So the same story tells us about another conference that took place in Havana in 2002, where then Lieutenant John Peterson on USS Beale, which was an American warship in the region, he said that, look, we were very frustrated that we were using these empty depth charges which were causing no damage to the Russian submarine. So what did they start doing? They started tying up some hand grenades into some kind of toilet paper tubes and throwing them in such a way that triggers were held back until they were just a few meters from the submarine. So that is to scare the submarine even more. It is in that situation that Arkhipov recalls, as recorded in these archives, the translated version of which has now been made public, that at that point the captain panicked and the captain said, let's go into an emergency dive because I don't know what's happening. And he said, once you went into an emergency dive, then there would have been no way of knowing whether the Americans were doing it just to warn you or for a show or they meant you harm. So there, even now, if we were able to stop the captain from firing a nuclear weapon, then would have been very difficult even to make that call. And in fact, there is also a mention in this detail someplace that the captain also could not move fast enough within the submarine to go to the other end to order a firing because the passage was too narrow and crowded with people. This is how close we came to a nuclear Armageddon then, 60 years back. So in fact, Arkhipov also recorded that he spoke with the captain and he said, listen, calm down. Maybe the Americans are signaling. Maybe they don't want to hurt us. At which point things calmed down. And the captain also, Savitsky, also decided to signal back. And that's when signals were exchanged and hostility level came down on the spot. Now, what was happening at the same time in Washington? While this was going on, 2 American U-2 aircraft. At that point, you remember those big U-2 aircraft, they were the spying resource that the Americans had. 2 disappeared. One disappeared over Cuba. It later turned out that it had been shot down by the Soviet forces there, on orders by two local commanders, and one more disappeared over Siberia. It later turned out that hadn't been shot down, that pilot had got disoriented by the bright aurora borealis. But the fact is, sitting in Washington, people see, oh, two U-2 aircraft have been lost, they've been shot down. That means a war has started. So everybody had the same sense that a war has started. So once again, these incidents, we need to remember, learn our lessons and see what's happened in the last 7-8 months. How close could we have been to some of these crises? In fact, it's in these situations that communication is very important, and possibly the only reason India and Pakistan were able to keep things so stable, and we didn't see much noise even from the Pakistani side, was that there was communication between the two sets of armed forces or the two security or military establishment. They spoke with each other, there was trust, and immediately that situation was controlled from getting out of hand. So once again, that's also a little answer to those, particularly in the Western world, who think that only the first P5 have the sense of responsibility to be able to manage nuclear weapons or to be able to live stably in a nuclear environment. The fact is that India and Pakistan managed it quite well with that Brahmos incident. And now that we've come this far with storytelling involving Vasily Arkhipov, the Soviet officer, he became a legend in his lifetime. And it's not just because he possibly played a very key role in preventing a nuclear Armageddon. At that point, the closest humanity has come to a nuclear war was 27th October 1962 as yet. There have been many other close calls and many other false alarms, but that was the most serious such incident. But you know what? He led an exciting life. So before this B-59 incident, he was on another nuclear submarine, that is a hotel class called K-19 in 1961. And that one was nuclear powered. So that one had a really bad incident with the leak of the reactor coolant. And again, at that point, technology was not that well advanced. These reactors were not so safe, and the captain of that submarine decided to do something about it, to try and control the leak, and asked his engineering section to do it. So his engineers very bravely got involved. They were able to control the leak. But you know what? Everybody, including Arkhipov was on that submarine also. He had the knack of being in the wrong place at the right time. So he was there. He also contributed to preventing that crisis or controlling that crisis. Everybody on that submarine was exposed to a lot of radiation. So all the engineering section, all the officers of the engineering section died within a month of that incident. They had taken so much radiation in their bodies. Arkhipov himself died subsequently at 72, again of kidney cancer, which was largely surmised to have been caused by his own exposure to that radiation. And he became quite a character in popular culture. In fact, in the 2002 or 3 film, K-19, the Widowmaker, K-19 was that submarine I told you. His character was played by Liam Neeson. And not to be left behind, Denzel Washington also played a similar character in a film called Crimson Tide, where he is an officer on the bridge of a vessel that refuses to carry out an order to launch a nuclear weapon. And you know what? There have been other close calls. I will not list all of them, but there is one more that I must mention. That also involves a Soviet officer, Soviet Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was just watching the screen in one of those places where you monitor missile launches in the US, and his screen had big letters, suddenly a warning coming saying launch. That means the Americans had launched something, and first indication was 1 Minuteman missile launch, and they calculated at Soviet Union, and then 4 more. So it's like 5 missiles had been launched. So if his dilemma was, should I inform my headquarters or not? If he had informed his headquarters, that was 26th of September 1983, still Soviet times. If he had informed his headquarters, the full Soviet doctrine would have come into play, which is an overwhelming total retaliation, nuclear retaliation. But he didn't do it because he somehow thought that, look, this sounds unreasonable or unrealistic. Maybe this is a false alarm. And as it turned out, it was a false alarm. You know what had happened? It was the sun rays reflecting off the clouds that some of the computers misjudged to be a missile launch. So once again, the lesson is when you have these weapons of mass destruction, one, you have to be very, very careful. You have to keep great communication with the rival side, as must have been the case over that Brahmos incident. Second, you have to be always willing to accept errors and learn from errors. And third, finally, be God-fearing. In the best of all worlds, there will be no nuclear weapons. But since this is not the best of all worlds, be God-fearing and don't talk about nuclear weapons loosely or lightly.